the taxpayers and see whether or not it's worthwhile. And sort of your break-even project is if the taxpayers have to spend $1 for a dollar's worth of benefits, that's sort of where you stop. So a ratio greater than 1 suggests a good project. The second part of the project analysis, and this really applies, I guess, to the private sector as well, but more so perhaps in the government side of things, is cost-effectiveness ratio. Very, very hard to initially, at least, measure the value or the benefit of the project in dollar terms. But we can measure it, let's say, in terms of reliability or performance or road design, injuries avoided or human lives saved, and then, try to figure out what should we do. In the end, it all comes down to dollars, which brings us up to this question of the value of the statistical human life, and that, when we back off on a design, make it less than perfectly sort of safe, and so we can expect statistical lives to be lost, we're trading off money for dollars. But of course, society can't afford to make things perfectly safe, and therefore there is that trade-off. So we want to talk a little bit about how society informs us as engineers as to how do we go about making those trade-offs, and what is, ultimately nothing is acceptable, but what is practical. Okay. And so those are the two types of things that we're looking at. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit about an example here. I'm going to work through the Skydome example, or Rogers Center, I guess it's called now, in terms of looking at perspective in terms of private enterprise versus the government. Okay. And Skydome initially was a public project, turned over to the private sector. We'll talk a little bit about how value is established in both those sectors and how different it really is. So some things to think about. Okay, we're going to use benefit cost ratio analysis for the first part of this. And here we're going to be quantitative about it. So as engineers, we quantify everything that we can, come up with an analysis, and make a recommendation. The politicians then look at intangibles, things that we as engineers could not quantify, and perhaps will decide on some economically suboptimal solution to the problem based on intangible factors, like getting reelected or something like that. Okay. So we're looking at it economically first. Well, social projects, public goods, or I guess if one person can use it, everyone can use it, sort of a general public good type project. And so those are the ones that we're looking at. Key thing here is time value of money. Most projects spend a lot of public money up front, and how do we trade off those future benefits? One might argue that because tax revenue is free, if you need money, government is just tax, that the time value of money is really very, very low. But of course, most governments are so deeply in debt that any capital spending has to be done through borrowing, so perhaps we should use the government's interest rate. Or perhaps you might say, there's only a limited pool of investment resources in the economy, why don't we hold government as responsible as we do corporations? And perhaps use interest rates that are more on the corporate side of things in terms of trade-off future public benefits versus public expenditures right now. So we'll talk a little bit about policy issues and how you might want to go about that. But we got to trade off future benefits versus current expenditures, and we need an interest rate to do that. Spillover benefits. Interesting about projects is usually they affect more than one public when you basically go ahead with the project. For example, water control project or a flood control project affects people who are, I guess, being displaced. If it's farmland gets displaced. However, if you're putting up a dam and you've got impounded water behind it, perhaps all of a sudden you've got a recreational area that you didn't have before. So there's a benefit. Okay. And so we need to try to figure out, well, what's the value of that benefit? What's the value of the lost land? What is the value of the major reason that we're doing it in terms of flood control, less damage? Not really the easiest thing to do, okay? But we have to come up with numbers, because if we don't, we're saying zero, which is definitely wrong. I guess we're all familiar with the sort of projects governments get involved with, protection, Army, police services, those sorts of things. We take a lot for granted in Canada in terms of the infrastructure or what's there for business to actually avail themselves of. We have a banking system, we have a financial system, we have a tax system, a transportation system. All of those things are basic infrastructure to create value, and the government is responsible for funding that. We are, through taxpayers, responsible for paying for it. On the cultural side of things, there are certain things that you just can't make money at, but society values. I mean, how many profitable ballet societies or universities, for that matter, exist? Okay. Ontario just recently made it legal for universities to be for-profit money-making organizations. And of course, it's very hard to find students who are willing to pay $25,000 or more to attend so they can make a profit. So these sorts of things are subsidized by the government. Resource management, we have flood control projects, those sorts of things. Key thing here, in terms of, I guess from the environmental point of view, to me it's always important that there be a level playing field. So, one company shouldn't incur all sorts of additional costs because they're being environmentally friendly, which will penalize the company and, customers buying stuff from them when other companies can get away with basically polluting. So part of the resource management is having a level playing field in terms of having minimum standards in terms of environmental protection. Okay? Therefore, the cost associated with each of the players will be the same. So those are sort of the projects. So we'll talk about flood control, we'll talk about some traffic enhancement projects, those sorts of things. Well, let me talk about Skydome. Okay. Well, large and costly. Definitely large, definitely costly. Initial cost of the project estimated at $250 million. Okay. So, the engineers did the design, they went to tender, and it was $240 million. Okay. By the time it was finished, it had cost $600 million. Who's on the hook for the difference? The Ontario taxpayer. Okay. And if one were to do some planning, that's not on the screen, but Ontario taxpayers would have done. If one were to do some planning, how would one justify that? Presumably, that the benefits to the City of Toronto and the province of Ontario somehow or other would be worth, at least from a planning point of view, more than $250 million. Because that was the planning number, and that's how you go forward. And, things didn't quite go according to plan, but that sometimes happens. Long project line, well, yeah, it's mostly concrete. So, governments can take the long-term view, largely because they use low interest rates, as we'll see. Okay, so they don't have that short-term profit view that private enterprise needs to get shareholder money to make something. Multiple use, well, facilities often are shared because, think about two corporations who could perhaps more cost-effectively manufacture their goods by sharing a factory. Well, for competitive reasons and trade secret reasons, that never happens. Right? But oftentimes, there are multiple use projects, a flood control project that would have recreational benefits, that might have irrigation benefits, benefiting different parts of the public. Or indeed, the Skydome itself in terms of, sports teams use, concerts, trade shows, all those sorts of things. The other thing is, governments, when they get involved, look at a very, very big view, and they can do things that individuals or corporations could. Could the Blue Jays or Argos afford to, put up a Skydome? The answer is absolutely not. They can barely afford to pay their players, right? So, government comes in to do grand things. Presumably, it benefits the public. Very, very difficult to evaluate these things. Indeed, even on the cost side, it is very difficult for the Skydome to get it right. And the benefits, of course, some of them are intangible, some aren't. How do you value them? That's the key part, the most difficult part of the public sector projects. Now, the framework that we're going to use, and when we basically describe a public project to you, really, we're looking at all of the aspects of the project, the tangible ones that we can convert to dollars. Right? And we're putting them essentially into 4 different pigeonholes, which basically will affect our analysis. Okay. We have benefits, so we try to quantify all of the good things about this project as far as the public is concerned. We ignore any benefits to the government authority that's creating the project. Then disbenefits, pollution, noise, displacing people, expropriating land, losing farmland, those sorts of things. We try to value that as well. Okay. And the net benefit to the public, benefit minus disbenefits. On the cost side, well, what's it going to cost? As you know, in larger projects, we're required by law, university and broader public sector, going to tender, and a tender process generally gives you a fairly good bid in terms of a competition between your contractors that are bidding on your work. So oftentimes, if you spec the problem correctly or the project correctly, you'll get a pretty good handle on the costs. If you've been loose in your spec, you're going to get killed on all the extras and the surprises as you move along. So specificity in the initial contract documents, very, very important. And savings, well, if you're actually charging income or you're charging revenue, like from Highway 407, for example, you now have to pay to drive on that highway. Those sorts of things help defray the costs. Or if there's cost savings on the project, we're going to look at the net cost of the government. We have two measures of merit, given that we've got net benefits and net costs. So B over C really, net benefits, net costs. One is the most popular in that it's good for marketing purposes. It's just a ratio, right? So if I say I got this project that's 2.3, it means that for every dollar a taxpayer spends, there's $2.30 worth of public benefits. Really good for marketing purposes in putting out your projects. It's a lot like the internal rate of return in Chapter 4, in the sense that it's a number that people can relate to. Equally well, it's like the internal rate of return in that the project with the highest B over C is not necessarily the best one, the one that's in the public interest. Okay. And so we need to talk a little bit about why that is and how you get around it. Benefit less costs is exactly like net present value in Chapter 4. One, it always gives you the right answer. And two, if it's positive, it's a project that's worth doing. However, saying the net present value of a project is $331,000 doesn't necessarily mean anything to many people, not perhaps as much as the B over C ratio. So the first one is most popular, and so we talk a little bit about how to use it properly. Okay. I guess I've got this example here where I'm talking a little bit about Skydome. And if I look at this framework here, and if I'm doing a planning exercise on it, and I think it's going to cost $250 million, how do I justify that? Well, I'm going to look at the positive effects on the public, right? And so, if I'm a sports fan, I'm going to be happy that, if I'm watching a game at the end of April or early May, and it's cold and it's raining, I can sit indoors. That has some value, presumably. Certainly not $250 million. Okay. I have the fact that perhaps it's going to be a tourist attraction. So we've got people coming in from all over, spending dollars here, creating employment, creating tax dollars. I have other desirable effects, conferences, people come for trade shows, they're on expense accounts, they spend a lot of money, hotels are happy, restaurants are happy, they all pay taxes. So you look at it from that overall point of view, okay? And there might be indeed be a fair amount of benefits. Okay? I always like to think about, spillover benefits as well. My favorite one is the hot dog vendors. If they just sit right on the front of Skydome, all of a sudden they're going to do really well because, there's thousands of people walking by. Well, they benefit as well. I don't know whether they pay taxes, whether they put all the money in their pockets or not, but they're not supposed to. So in theory, they're going to pay taxes as well. Negative effects? Well, if you want to use the Gardner and you're driving south along there and there's a game, you're not happy that Skydome is there. Because, it's traffic is nightmare whenever there's a game. Okay? People talk about, pollution, it's an eyesore, all of these sorts of things. Not to mention the risk to the city and the province of actually putting up something like this, especially with something as novel as a roof that moves. Okay? And indeed, the risk was there, and the risk actually was realized in terms of a negative $250 million variance. Okay? So there's risk as well. That's a disadvantage. The costs, well, if you went to tender, you think you got a good cost, well, you're wrong. Savings, well, I guess income. The Skydome does pay property taxes, so the City of Toronto does get revenue, and indeed, all of this other spillover effect in terms of taxes coming into the government may indeed help pay for this. Okay. Well, of course, Skydome went up, and we have an association that all sort of tourist attractions pay into, the Metro Toronto Convention and Tourism Association. Even New College pays into it, because we run a hostel business in the summer. And they did a study in terms of, is it good for government to spend this sort of money on tourist attractions in the City of Toronto? And they did much what we did. They got an engineering company to have a close look at it and value these things. And they come up with basically a value in terms of benefits, net benefits, of around $260 million a year. Yeah. That is to the metro area, Greater Toronto area. And about $350 million to the province, i.e. people coming in to Skydome, going down to Niagara Falls, or whatever, traveling in the province, spending money. Okay. So indeed, it seems like it was worthwhile doing from a point of view of, if I'm getting $264,000 or $350 million a year extra benefit, then that expenditure may indeed have been worthwhile. And of course, over time, the facility did get full in terms of event base. Now, interesting thing, in this course, we always talk about incremental analysis. Of course, that's not what they did here. They asked the question, what are all the benefits associated with Skydome? Well, if Skydome weren't there, we still had a place for our sports teams to play. We still had hotels, we still had conference areas. There was still the exhibition place. Okay. And so the incremental expense was $600 million. This doesn't tell you the incremental benefits. And they're significantly less because this includes all of the venues that we already had in the city, okay, and basically displacing the use of those. So from an economic point of view, it really had some problems. Now, what happened? Well, ultimately, Rogers owns it. So the public view on this, and spending $250 million going ahead, was in this sort of view of overall tax benefits, benefits to society, all of these global things. If I'm a company and I'm looking at buying this, do I care about any of that? Absolutely not. It's 1 minus T, revenue minus expenses, plus the depreciation tax savings, present value, end of story. Okay. So, government didn't really like being in the business of running this thing, and they decided they wanted to get rid of it. And of course, they had to find a buyer, and the buyer would be in the private sector, a profit-making organization. And if you did an evaluation of this, of course, you know, you never would have put up a $600 million facility. It's just not there. There was a company, a consortium actually, of folks that basically, so this is now 1989 when it actually went up. The city and the province got bored with it over those 5 years and tried to find an investor. Investments basically looked at it the way we do in Chapter 5 and said, we can make a go of it if we can get this thing at a bargain basement price of $151 million. So the present value of the revenue stream plus depreciation tax savings, they can make a profit at their cost of capital. And that's what the province was actually the owner, sold it for. So they paid $151 million. And where did this difference? Who's paying for that difference? You and I are still paying for it. Once you start working, you're going to continue to pay for it. It's in the provincial debt. Okay. Now, as it turns out, at 151, they couldn't make a go of it. So they went bankrupt. Okay. And when you go bankrupt, the assets go into bankruptcy court. And they look for the highest bidder. Another consortium said, you know what? We can make a go of it. And this is called Sportsco. And again, they look at the Chapter 5 analysis on this, and they say, we can make a go of it if we get it for $80 million. Okay. Well, they couldn't make really a go of it either. Finally, Mr. Rogers said, you know, you guys are not making any money, you're losing money. Be happy to take it off your hands. So Rogers puts in an offer for $25 million. And they're happy to get $25 million. They also promised to spend about 10 or 15, no, actually it was more than that, $25 million on refurbishing the place. Because now the place is starting to fall apart. I mean, it's 25 years old. About 15 years old. Yeah. So they get it for $25 million. And hopefully at $25 million they can make a reasonable profit. So from a government point of view, you look at a total local view, and you can afford to spend this much because everyone's benefit. As a company, you can't. You just look at that very, very narrow profit motive, and you can say that the value is a function of what you think you can earn versus your expenses over time. And you know, if the model doesn't work, you go bankrupt, and the value of the asset goes down. Hopefully, someone can make a go of it. And so that's where it stands right now. Now, interesting enough, Rogers, who has their name on our department, paid $25 million to the University of Toronto as a donation for that privilege. So I'll let you decide whether they got better value from Skydome or putting their name on our department. I will make no comment on that whatsoever. Okay, so again, different in perspective. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about the nitty-gritty of doing this, and I'll give you an example next day of the type of project we're looking at here. We want to try to value benefits, we want to make that trade-off in terms of current expenditure, you know, $240 million or $600 million versus the future benefits over time. These are long-term projects. We need time value money. We'll talk about the issues there. We oversee the most popular method. Just take the present value of benefits, present value of costs, and get a number. Okay. Oftentimes in these type of projects, most of your data is in annual amounts at the end of each year. So you can use an EUAC, or equivalent uniform annual cost approach, and the number crunching gets much easier. Indeed, with large projects, if you use present value, you've got millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, all sorts of digits to carry. Oftentimes, EUAC is the better way because the numbers are much smaller, less likely to make a mistake for computation. So EUAC is probably the best way to go with these sort of projects. It's equivalent, right? Now, with the present value approach, we're just looking at the public benefits. We're weighing them. So this is nothing more than a statement of present value calculations. We're looking at each of the options, and we're saying project is in the public interest, or it's worth spending if the overseas is greater than 1. And we'll talk about capital constraint later on. She can't take all the projects that are in the public interest. Government simply can't afford it. The net present value method, basically just by looking at B minus C, also gives you an answer. This one is always correct in terms of the largest B minus C is the best project. B over C, the largest B over C ratio is not necessarily a project in the most public interest when you have mutually exclusive ones where you have to rank them. Okay. So if you, just like IRR, if you have to rank them, you've got to be careful with B over C. If they're independent, then both of them will give you the same answer. So identical, parallel to the IRR analysis, same sorts of problems. Okay. Now, to deal with the B over C a problem in terms of making sure you get the best project, the algorithm, again, is very, very similar to internal rate of return, and you want to ensure, and I guess I've said it there, ensure each increment of public expense returns sufficient benefits. So you want to do that pairwise comparison on the incremental investment. So just like internal rate of return method from Chapter 4, you rank your public projects in increasing order in terms of public expenditure at end of year 0. You start with the cheapest one and compare it with the next most expensive one. Take the winner and then compare that to the next most expensive one until you run out of pairs. That's really what that algebra is about. So it's exactly the same as the example we did when we closed up Chapter 4 in terms of that internal rate of return, that decision tree that we had on the board. Okay. So same sort of analysis. We're looking incrementally on each successive public investment in terms of the more expensive project. For B minus C, simply calculate the value of B minus C for each alternative and select the maximum. Right, so if they're mutually exclusive, you only need one, and therefore the maximum B minus C is the way to go. Okay. Now we can bias the numbers, and sometimes if we have a project that we want to put forward, B minus C or B over C might lead us to different conclusions. And so we'll talk a little bit about the problems associated with that when we look at some of the special topics in the public sector. I want to just talk a little bit in general about how to go about this. Because there's a bunch of ways of trying to decide what are the best projects. This is a public sector project in the sense that it's resource management, it's flood control. So it's something that governments would get involved with. We have 4 alternatives here. And when I look at the cost, the equivalent cost is just, remember, I've got a one-time only cost. Think about if I have a planning period of, well, however long it is, spreading that cost out over that planning period. Okay. So I've turned everything here to an end of period uniform cost. Okay. And that's equivalent to NPV because they're equivalent, right? They're just an A given P or P given A away from each other. Now, I've got a do nothing. Now, do nothing means that the public will have a negative benefit, if you will, of doing nothing to the tune of $200,000. What that really means is that there's flood damage downstream that will cost the public out of their own pockets $200,000 to repair. Okay. So it's basically affecting the public, and when I say the public, I mean the taxpayer. Okay. And so do nothing every year, on average, $200,000 a year worth of flood damage that someone in the public, not the government, but the actual citizens have to pay for. Put in a small flood control project and costing $40,000 a year, and the damages go down by 70,000. So all of a sudden, people are paying $70,000 a year on average less to fix their property because it rains and you have a really heavy rain. And successively spending more money means that indeed you've got less and less general, and therefore the savings to the general tax-paying public is greater. Well, where do you stop? Okay. Well, if you're a politician getting elected by the folks downstream, you'll say, well, nothing's too good for my folks, because I want to get reelected. And therefore, option 4 is the one that makes the most sense. Right? Let's spend the money and reduce, virtually eliminate all of the flood damage. Okay. But if you're a politician, let's say, living somewhere else, nowhere near the river, you can say, well, I don't want to spend any of our money on this. I mean, these people, they bought their property down at the end of the river. They know it floods, and didn't they save $50,000 on their house because of that? I mean, it's like people, buying a house next to the airport and complaining about airport traffic noise. I mean, they got their house for $50,000 less as a result. Don't like it, move. So that politician would say, absolutely not, do nothing. Right? Okay. A budget committee might say, well, we've only got so much money to spend, so let's sort of stop where we've got the money, irrespective of the actual damage or the benefits to the public. Okay. So there's a number of different viewpoints. And the way to look at it, again, is are we getting value for each chunk of invested capital? Okay. And I got, I guess, a bunch of numbers here. B over C ratio. Okay. If you had looked at Chapter 6, you might say, well, the best project is the one that has the largest B over C. Okay. Well, benefit over cost in Project 2 is 1.75. It's the best if you're using that metric. But is it the one that is in the most public interest? Well, the other way to look at it is, well, what about for each chunk of invested capital? Okay. Well, if I spend the $40,000 a year, remember that's construction cost, on alternative 2 over doing nothing, it's a 1.75 return. If I spend the additional $90,000 a year, or sorry, $80,000 a year, $80,000 a year, I get a positive benefit. So perhaps this one, number 3, is better because both chunks of invested capital return more than, or have a V over C greater than 1. And finally, if I listen to the politician whose constituents are getting flooded, I'm looking at a situation of spending another 40 to gain $30,000 worth of benefits. That's not necessarily good. Okay. So perhaps the right answer is not the largest V over C, but the point at which the incremental benefits are less than 1. That's where I stop. Okay. So the recommendation here, I'm going to stop here. I'll just go on the board with this next day to start out. The recommendation here is not the largest V over C, not 2, but it's 3, because both investments incrementally return a V over C greater than 1. And that's sort of the premise that we're going to be using for V over C analysis as we move through more complicated projects. Okay. So I'll just go see you right.
大家看的能调暗不？是自动调暗还是都是要手动的？这边有